Good evening and welcome to another episode of A Closer Look, a show dedicated to bringing you the facts. We ask the questions that others won't, and we get the answers that no one else can. I'm Arabina Apia. Thank you so much for joining me. Each week, I'll be here to talk you through current stories spurring national debate. You've heard the stories, and now it's time to take a closer look. In just a few, we're going to sit down with the Director of Antiquities and Monuments to discuss plans that are in the works to preserve our historical monuments, icons, and even our historic over-the-hill communities. Before that, we take a look at this week's Millennial in Government.
What's the Bahamas doing in the fight against COVID?
We're empowering Bahamians with free testing, free masks, and access to doctors for answers to your questions. Vaccines and boosters are saving lives. We have tighter restrictions at our borders, and we're expanding hospital capacity and hiring more nurses and doctors. We're taking on COVID while reopening schools and keeping our economy moving.
Together, we're moving forward.
Welcome back. You're watching A Closer Look, a show which not only takes a look at the stories you care about, but which also carves out the opportunity for young Bahamians to be recognized. Joining me in studio now is Namiko Miller from the Antiquities, Monuments, and Museums Corporation. Thank you so much for joining me.
Glad to be here.
Okay, so my first question is, how does a young person like yourself get into antiquities and monuments? What do you do exactly, and what made you want to get into this field?
Okay, so I am the curator at Antiquities Monuments Museums Corporation, and my job entails a lot of different tasks. So that includes developing exhibitions, interpretation for programs, developing special projects, tour guides, training the tour guides, helping them along with their tours, and a lot of different aspects to my job.
And what would you say has been your most rewarding or meaningful experience with Antiquities and Monuments so far?
Developing exhibitions. So I am a history buff. Well, my background is in history. I have a bachelor's in history. And so coming up from that, I just love to tell stories. And so I can tell stories in different ways with history, interpreting that to different audiences. And that could be, like I said, in my exhibitions and our special programs, interpretation. Our Living History program is one that's really, really popular with our audience. And so I can also tell our story through that, giving history a human component to it, to make it feel more accessible to our audience.
Tell us a little bit about that Living History program.
So Living History and program, it entails our West India Regiment soldiers who were stationed at the forts. And so we have our interpretive team who are dressed as soldiers, and they actually do drills. So they would march around the forts. You would hear drums, you would hear the music. Sometimes we have bands like the Defense Force Officer Band or the Police Band. They also march around the forts with drills, and then they fire the cannon at the end. So the big boom at the end is the firing of the cannon.
Can you give me an idea, or in your opinion, what are some of the things that might be missing from the telling of the Bahamian story?
That human aspect, because when we talk about our forts and we talk about our other historical sites, we just look at what we read and probably primary sources, our secondary sources, but there's always that human aspect, because there are persons who live there. The soldiers lived there, they had their families there, so what exactly happened to them? Can we tell their story? And one thing that I love to tell about Fort Charlotte that a lot of people don't know is that gambling, a history of gambling actually started at Fort Charlotte. There was where the soldiers during their off time, they would ride the ponies for money.
Wow.
And so that's what they did in their off time. So it's a lot of stories, different aspects of stories of history that you can tell about our historical sites.
Okay. What piece of advice, as a millennial in government, what piece of advice would you give to other millennials, young Bahamians, who are hoping to not just get into the public service, but who may want to join you at the Antiquities and Monuments and Museums?
Have a love of storytelling. Be someone who is passionate, and especially know your history. We do that a lot. We do that every day at our historical sites. We do that in our programs, our special projects. That's what we love to do. Just telling the story to an audience, and just love your history and storytelling and be passionate about it.
Well, our correspondents were able to follow Namiko in her habitat at Collins House. Let's take a look at what they uncovered.
Telling the story of the Bahamas, like the history of Collins House, which is right behind me, is no easy task. It's almost as intricate as weaving together a big Broadway production with all of the actors, sights, sounds, and scenes. But for AMMC curator Namiko Miller, it's not such a daunting task. In fact, she does it with vigor, excitement, and pride.
My biggest thing that I love to do is developing exhibitions. So I love to tell the story of history in a different way. With my background in history, I found that writing articles, you only cater to a certain audience, and that audience is small, that audience is academic. So with interpretation and developing exhibitions, you can cater to a large audience, and you can get more people involved and get them to love history.
As a passionate writer and avid reader, Namiko found history a natural fit. After gaining her bachelor's degree in history, she searched for new ways to bring history to life. That led her to the world of museum studies.
In the world of museum studies, they actually teach you to interpret history in different ways. And so that can be through a short story, that can be through developing an exhibition that's more interactive. So you have 3D effects and all of that involved. You also can have an interpretation that involves persons actually acting out, dressed in historical clothing. And so that's very good. And that's also good for photo opportunities for our guests, and they absolutely love that. So my
Kind of
job
like
is,
reaching back and bringing it forward.
It is, exactly. And one thing about history, especially Bahamians, you know, a lot of people think that history is boring, but it's not. It's in the way that you interpret to your audience.
As a curator, she says, we've yet to scratch the surface of telling the story of the Bahamas.
Is there anything that you think is missing or needs to be added to our Bahamian narrative, our story?
There is a lot that needs to be added. There's a lot that's missing. With museum studies, the most I can do is to develop the exhibitions to tell these stories, because there are a lot of stories that are not told. There are a lot of stories that are forgotten. There are a lot of stories that people would like to forget, but you have to also understand that they're a part of our history. We cannot forget it. We cannot brush it off. We can tell our stories. We have to tell our stories to make people understand and love history.
And as we were on a very historic site, Namiko shared some of that history.
So we're here at Collins House, a very historic site, and what we're standing on now, I understand, used to be a waterfall.
It was.
Tell me a little bit about that.
So if you look around along here, the water came from there and it flowed all the way down here.
Wow.
These tiles are the original tiles. And so the plan is to restore this in its historic form. So we don't want to change anything. And that's where our historical architecture and our historical preservation department comes in play. So we want to actually restore this whole thing so it actually looks like the cool water feature that it was back in the day.
Awesome. Which year was this built? And give me a little bit of history about Collins House.
Okay, so Collins House was built in 1929 by Ralph Collins. So Ralph Collins was a big businessman in Nassau. He had a lot of businesses, and this building is particularly rich in history because who all was there. So it was once the home of St. Andrew's School. So St. Andrew's School was here also, and it also was the home to the Ministry of Education at some point.
With so much passion to tell the Bahamian story, I cannot wait to see what else Namiko Miller has in store. I'm Jillian Gray, back to you in studio.
Definitely so many exciting things happening over at Antiquities and Monuments. Thank you, Namiko, so much for joining me. Thank you so much for being here. Up next, we have more show. Stay tuned.
Jillian Gray, and this is Up Close.
Just recently, the Closer Look Road team had an opportunity to sit down with Dr. Chris Curry, who is director of the Antiquities and Monuments and Museums Corporation. Let's take a look at what they uncovered over at Fort Fincastle.
The Antiquities, Monuments and Museums Corporation is the premier keeper of Bahamian heritage and tradition. Corporation Dr. Chris Curry tells us about their role and restoration efforts.
We are the protectors of the patrimony of the Bahamas, which is to simply say we protect and safeguard from persons possibly coming in, scavengers and persons who might want to take from our waters, archaeological artifacts, or persons who would want to come in here and do work on land that is not registered and hasn't been given the licensing authority. We want to make sure that the water tower is restored for our 50th anniversary of independence. We also are going to work towards creating a terraced area for the straw vendors, and ultimately we want to make the entire Bennett's Hill area, which includes Water Tower, Fincastle, and of course the leading steps, the 66 steps that bring us up here, we're going to make it entirely pedestrian. We want to work towards, first of all, doing a huge PR campaign to get people aware that the forts are here. And of course, in that PR campaign, we want to make sure we're appreciating that our visitors aren't just people that come from foreign lands. We want our Bahamian visitors, our school kids to come here. We want to develop plans that will entice them here. We want to develop immersive tours. We want to have marching bands. We want to have drilling. We want to do all these sort of things that get people to not just hear and see, but also do things.
So can you tell us a little bit about the history of where we are right now?
Well, Mason's Addition would be considered one of those really rich historic areas that we would call over the hill. But it was actually settled by a lot of West Indians who came here in the 1920s and 30s to work either in tourism or to also do construction work. Some of them also were educators and nurses. So you had some skilled persons in here, vibrant community. You have some very important names, mind you, in the Fincastle area behind us. And as we go further down, you actually have the homestead of Perry Christie, one of our former prime ministers, and even further down along McCoy Corner getting towards East Street, the home of Sir Lyndon Pinling, our first prime minister for the Commonwealth of the Bahamas.
What are the plans to restore the Mason's Additions area?
Right, so we're working really as clients to the Ministry of Works to have lighting on these steps, and then of course to balance and stabilize the steps. So because as you can see, some of them have been broken by rooted plants and other things. So they're somewhat unstable now. We're going to have a stakeholders meeting coming up where we're going to engage the community and talk about what they would like to see for the community. So that's a very important part of what we're doing. And then secondly, once we have community buy-in, we're looking at plaquing buildings, houses, both in the Fincastle and the Mason's Addition area. So all of that is about enhancing the community, getting their buy-in, having them involved. We want to see eventually guided tours through the Mason's Addition area. And you can imagine the theme here is you can walk from the water tower down Dead Cat Alley right into Mason's Addition, and you can get a guided tour by a Bahamian.
Thanks for joining us into this deep dive into our history. Back to you, Arabina and Dr. Curry in studio. I'm Catherine Gomez.
Well, thank you so much, Catherine. We're very lucky to have Dr. Chris Curry in studio tonight. Thank you so much for being here.
It's great to be here.
Awesome. So we've learned so much from your package here. So give us an idea. Can you provide any timelines for some of these amazing plans that Antiquities and Monuments is really getting into?
Well, let's start with talking about Fort Fincastle when we want to open it. We've, of course, been closed really since COVID in 2020, and we've been working assiduously to open our forts. And so we're looking tentatively at the April 19th. This is right after our Easter Monday to open Fort Fincastle. We may have to move that by a week, but we're really looking closely to that third week in April. We already have the gift shop, mind you, open at Fort Fincastle, and we have a lot of treats. We offer native, authentic Bahamian candies made by Mortimer's. We have rum cakes from Purity Bakery. We also sell a lot of different, what you call souvenir items inside our gift shop. But really the big event coming up is the opening of Fort Fincastle. We're training our tour guides. We're actually going to do some orientation over the next couple of weeks to give them some new skills and to reshape the narrative of how we tell our story about Fincastle and other heritage sites.
Well, that's great. It sounds like you guys are incorporating all sorts of different types of people, all vendors, Bahamians from all walks of life. How important is that to Antiquities and Monuments?
Well, I feel like a lot of times we focused maybe in the past too much on the tourists. And by the way, tourists are very important to the economy, to, of course, our revenue streams. But, you know, we also understand that Bahamians need to know their own history. Marcus Garvey said it best, a man without knowledge of his past is like a tree without roots. So we want our Bahamians to be rooted in their heritage and their history. And the best way to do that is to experience it, to come out and immerse yourself in Fort Fincastle and all that we're going to offer you. And the same would be said about Fort Charlotte, which will be opened a little bit later in the calendar year. We also already have our museums open, Pompeii and Balcony House. We're also looking at opening Fort Montague down the line as well.
Mm-hmm. What would you say is the most exciting thing that you have coming up? Like, what are you most excited about?
Well, I'm most excited really about opening Fort Fincastle because we have some plans. Just to give you an example, Namiko, who was on earlier, would have talked about her role as curator. But what we've installed inside Fort Fincastle is a projector that actually tells the story of Fincastle in a sort of interactive way. And we actually have it programmed in 2 languages right now, 4 languages, French and Spanish. We're going to add Mandarin, and of course it's in English as well. And so one of the other things we're looking at is doing sort of virtual tours using, of course, the Wi-Fi capabilities that we now have, and then with people with tablets and devices can come in and you can actually interact without actually having a tour guide. You can learn a lot about the fort and do sort of a virtual tour. So there's some interesting IT ideas that we are passing around in our staff area, and we're really excited about those things.
Yes, very cool. Namiko did mention that the Antiquities and Monuments is looking at telling Bahamian history in different ways. How do you think that is going to be received, especially by a younger generation of Bahamians?
Well, I think you have to be sincere and authentic. As a career educator, one of the things I always told my students from when I started teaching is we should never perfume our past. We should never sanitize it. We should tell the story as it is, and so what we want to do is tell more of a story about ourselves. In the past we might have focused more on, who was the king or who was the queen at the time, or the soldiers that would have been brought in here from England. But what we now want to talk about and focus more on is who were the persons that worked in and around these forts, that were the enslaved, that were the free blacks, that were the persons who chiseled out the forts, who, through their labor created these mammoth structures that are left for us to observe and enjoy. So we want to tell the story. What was it like, the day in the life of a free black who might have been hired to work the construction site that became the canyon that is the 66 steps? And what was work like? What was the working conditions like? Those kind of things, are really interesting, fascinating stories that I think our public want to hear, whether you're a tourist from abroad or you're a Bahamian who lives here.
That's really, really cool. Okay, so tell us something that you think the public does not know that you would like them to know about the work that is being done by Antiquities and Monuments.
Well, a lot of people don't know the behind the scenes. Like we of course do exhibits, but we also have an archaeology unit, we have a preservation unit, we also have what we call a conservation unit. When you find, like, for example, if you were to find a canyon or a cannonball underwater, when you pull it out of the water and it has contact with air, you have this sort of chemical process that begins. And so to protect that cannon or to protect that ball, you have to actually have it preserved in a certain way. You put it in water, and they have they put electricity through the water, and it takes the particles off of the artifact, and it preserves it better. So we have conservationists who have specialized in that kind of scientific side. But there are some other factoids that people may not know that is interesting. Like, for example, Lord Dunmore, who built Fort Charlotte and Fort Fincastle, had a second title. He was called the Viscount of Fincastle. So that's a title that obviously explains why Fincastle is named after him. He was kind of a bit of an egomaniac. He named a lot of things after himself. There's at least 2 Dunmore streets, I believe, and there's a Dunmore town in Harbor Island. Yes. So he seemed to be doing a lot more than less.
Okay. I know that, you've talked about wanting to reach out and really have Bahamians engage, how can persons get involved? If they wanted to learn more from the Antiquities and Monuments and Museums Corporation, what would they need
Well,
to
the
do?
first and most obvious is to visit our sites. And we are opening, like I said, very soon. But really, Pompeii is a museum downtown. And it's been open since the end of January. And it is one of the most visited museums on Bay Street. And there aren't any other museums, really. But there are other places that you could visit. And it's a really great place to visit because it tells the story of Pompeii and other enslaved persons and the Herculean efforts that they went through to find freedom. Okay, and so we would encourage that. We would also encourage people to look at our Facebook page. We have a Facebook page. We're engaging in social media. We're looking at moving and broadening our social space on social media and having a greater presence there. Obviously, you can still contact us by phone. We're always interested in finding ways that we can reach out and connect with people. We're also working on revitalizing our website. So all these things are in the mix for the future.
Okay, I'm going to ask you the same question I asked Amico, and that is, what do you think is missing from the way we tell the story of the Bahamas now?
Well, I think what's missing is, a lot of times we used to tell the history sort of what I call a top-down perspective, where you learn about the people who ruled rather than the people that were unfortunately ruled by the rulers. So we want to talk about telling history from the bottom up, learning about the everyday lives of ordinary people who found a way of eking out a living in the Bahamas. And again, not perfuming the past, but telling it in a way that's real and authentic. And I always say history is about telling a good story and making a good argument. But we're more interested at Antiquities, I think, in telling a story. So we want to find out those interesting stories that maybe a lot of people didn't know about and bringing that to light. And I think, that is part of our oral tradition.
Well, that sounds great. I'm so happy that you joined us, Dr. Curry. Thank you so much for being here.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So we're not perfuming the past, but we will be back right after this.
The revitalization of Fort Fincastle is well on its way. The historic monument has played a vital role as one of the most visited tourist attractions in the Bahamas. We spoke to a few local ambassadors who have contributed to the experience on site.
If you look around here, you can see this need a massive renovation. So as soon as that happens, I think it will increase business. So, we could carry more funds home to our families. And in the condition what it is still is amazing. For the experience here, they should put some live music around here for the culture and, some food like conch salad, conch fritters, stuff like that, for them to get a better understanding of the culture.
Right, so talk about the experience of how the tourists like the coconut water, and you'll put the straws in the coconut for them to drink it, and they get the natural coconut in their hands.
They love it. It's a good experience for me, but they love it.
They love it.
Yes, sir.
Now they're going to renovate the Fort Fincastle and then also assist with the renovation of the vendors up there as well.
Yes, sir.
And they're also probably looking for places to put you guys as well so that the tourists can get a better experience
Yes, sir.
of what they're receiving now. How do you feel about that?
It's pretty good. I would love it. It's a nice experience for the Bahamas.
Do you have any recommendations on what they can do to improve it some more for you guys?
Try clean up the place a little bit.
If you've been watching our show for a few years, then you've probably noticed that this season has been totally revamped to include correspondents. From time to time, these correspondents will be joining us on set to join in on the conversation directly. It's my pleasure tonight to welcome two of our private sector correspondents, Catherine Gomez and Marco Sempersta. Thanks guys for joining us tonight.
No problem.
Okay, so Catherine, we'll start with you. You had an opportunity to go along with Dr. Chris Curry to Fort Fincastle. Tell us a little bit about that experience. What was it like being in the thick of things?
Oh my goodness, it was such an enlightening experience because I've learned so much about our historical monuments. You know, it was definitely better than just having a history lesson, actually being and actually seeing the historical monuments and him telling me the history of it was such a great experience. And it was also great to know the plans in the pipeline that the government has to refurbish our historical monuments, because it's so important for us to preserve these important landmarks. It also was a great experience learning what they plan to do with the historical monuments in terms of the plan to make it more so than a visit to the historical monuments, but an experience. So Dr. Curry was telling me they plan to incorporate Junkanoo performances, acting performances from the past, an experience like that for the locals and tourists alike. So that was such a great experience knowing what we have planned.
Awesome, awesome. And Marcos, your story ran last week. You had an interview with the Senator Quinton Lightburn. Tell us a little bit about what you learned over at the Bahamas Development Bank.
I think what I enjoyed most with Senator Quinton Lightburn was finding out all of the opportunities that exist with the Bahamas Development Bank. I think for a long time, a lot of people have not really known that it's there for our use and for us to actually start small to medium-sized businesses. It was also good to find out about their plans for the orange, green, and blue economies in the Bahamas. And so it was also really enlightening to know that so many opportunities exist for young people. That I come from a background of working in commercial banks, and so I know how hard and how stringent the policies may be trying to get development loans and trying to fund your own small business. And so I think it was phenomenal to know that the Bahamas Development Bank actually offers these same services with less stringent policies.
Very good to know, very good to know. Well, it's exciting. I'm excited about all of the future stories that both of you are going to be covering. And thank you guys so much for joining me in studio. Well, ladies and gents, we've certainly learned a lot here tonight. I want to thank Dr. Chris Curry for joining us this evening and helping us take a closer look at this issue. Thank you to this week's Millennial in Government, Namiko Miller, and thank you for tuning in. If you have questions or comments about anything we discussed here tonight, be sure to head over to social media and weigh in via our social media platforms. Till next time, I'm Arabina Apia, and I'll be here next week for a closer look at the stories grabbing headlines. Good night, everyone.